A group of 4 brave adventurers, hot on the trail of an orc horde who have kidnapped the daughter of a prominent lord, approach the mouth of a cave. Carefully they enter. As the torch illuminates the room before them, they are horrified by what they see. On the floor there is nothing but rock, mud, and dirt. The gods, for whatever reason, have not etched lines into the ground to represent 5-foot increments. Paralyzed with fear, these 4 adventurers stand there, not knowing how far they can walk or move. They are stuck as they stand there, motionless, paralyzed, unable to take one step forward, not knowing where the next 5 feet begins and ends. 7 orc warriors charge from the darkness and slaughter them where they stand. If only the floor had a grid. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Black Magic Craft. This time I want to cover what I think will probably end up being a controversial issue, although I'm going to try to cover it from all sides. But I'm sure some of you will get upset and stressed out over what I have to say here. But I want to talk about grids. It's a common, reoccurring discussion that happens in the community. Whenever somebody has gridless terrain, inevitably somebody loses their shit and freaks out. Well, how can you play without a grid? Or you get the questions of, how do you handle combat without a grid? My group is considering doing it. And people just get really hung up on this concept of having a grid on your terrain. It's like it's so ingrained in the mentality of gamers because of the years of the 1-inch, battle maps, that some people, when they see something without it, they can't even comprehend the idea of playing without one. It just seems so unnatural and foreign. I'm here to say that the grid is a lie. You don't need it. And I know some of you are just going, yeah, obviously, and a lot of people play without one, but there are people who that concept is just unfathomable to them. I don't want to say that the grid is bad or that you shouldn't use it. This is not what this video is about. The grid is tried and true, and it has its place, and it's useful. I use it on a lot of my terrain. The point of this video is to say that you don't need it. And if you're thinking about not using it, I'm here to say why that's okay, and to kind of try to say how to handle not using a grid for those of you who are unsure about how to actually run it without a grid. First of all, the grid. Why do we use it? Well, I mean, it's practical and it's very useful for quick gameplay. I mean, your players and monsters and NPCs all have stats about their movement. That is a part of the mechanics of the game. So in combat, you and your players need to know how far things are away from each other, how far somebody can move. Often a PC may have a greater move than a villain or a monster, and that's really important in combat. So the grid is a very fast way that's very intuitive because of everybody's long history of various board games. It's a fast way to just quickly move 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. It's like playing checkers, right? It's really simple. Your 8-year-old can understand it really easily, but the grid has some downsides. One being dealing with curved movement, diagonal movement, circles, and the fact that, I'm gonna be honest, a lot of terrain, if you put a grid on it, looks like shit. Grass does not have a grid. Cave floors do not have a grid. I put a grid on my terrain where it makes sense. If you have a tiled stone floor that has grout lines, well, it's very easy to just implement the grid because it doesn't damage the aesthetics of the piece or the realism, and you have that grid there. But if you're in the forest or you're out in the plains or whatever, there is absolutely nothing in nature that would justify having man-made lines on the ground. And to me personally, I think it makes terrain look ridiculous and unbelievable. So that is my personal rule. If there's something like stonework or tile or wood planks, somewhere where there are straight, unnatural man-made lines on the floor, I will use that to implement the grid. But the second I'm in a place like a cave or on grass or in the woods, I don't use it because it doesn't make sense. But then how do you deal with combat, you ask? Well, the thing is, it's really easy, and there's a few different things to consider when talking about gridless terrain and gridless play. First, you have to consider ways that you can still utilize the mechanics of movement in an accurate and fair way, and there's a bunch of different ways you can do that. But you also have to consider maybe throwing those mechanics out for the sake of the game and story. But first I'm going to deal with, you want to preserve the mechanics of movement and the fairness and the stats. So you have gridless terrain and you want to measure movement. People are constantly asking how you do that without a grid, which is kind of hilarious to me because it seems pretty obvious. What is the way that you can measure movement when you have no grid? A measuring tape? A ruler? Those 1-inch grids, just use a ruler and you can measure it. I mean, board gamers have been doing that for decades. That's the most obvious answer. Just get a ruler, and 1 inch equals 5 feet, just like your grid. And the nice thing is you can go diagonally and it makes sense. You can also just use a stick that has 1-inch marks on it, black, white, that's really quick. Every player can have one at the table. You can do what I often do and take your pen or your marker that you're using that is about the distance of 30 feet of movement, and yep, you can move to about there. If you're a little bit more liberal with the preciseness of your measurement. Another great option is something flexible like a string. If you get a piece of string or rope or a pipe cleaner or something that is equal to 30 feet of movement, the nice thing is that you can bend that in any shape and it's really accurate. That's actually a really elegant way to track movement without a grid. But me personally, I'm not that worried about it, so I play pretty loose. The other thing is you look at a tile set like this, and some smart viewers have pointed this out in the last video. I didn't put a grid on this, but there is a grid on this table. Each one of these tiles in my cave system is 3 inches. So that means each one of these squares is 3 by 3 or 15 feet of in-game distance. So 2 full tiles is 30 feet of movement. So if you have 30 feet of movement, you can very quickly move a character from one tile to 2 over in the exact same position, and that's 30 feet. This is 15 feet, this is 15 feet, 2 of them are 30. It's really obvious, so there is still a hidden superficial grid there. It's just scaled up, and without sacrificing any of the aesthetic of adding unnatural lines where they don't need to be. But those are all ways that you can still essentially be stuck within the constraints of the mechanic of movement. Personally, and this isn't for everybody, but it's for a lot of people, I think that those measurement restrictions can actually be detrimental to the game, and I prefer to be a lot more loose with it and follow the rule of cool. And what I mean by that is, if you have a character that falls 1 centimeter short of movement on the game board to being able to attack an enemy in 1 turn, I don't like the idea of being so strict that I say, nope, you can only make it to there and you'll have to complete the move in the next turn. Now, I'm not talking about being, half a movement too short, but very close. And I just let that happen because it's better for the game, the turn structure, everything to just be more fluid and more interesting and more fun. And the reason for that is not just so that the turns go more smoothly, but it's also because I don't want this game board to become so tactile that every time somebody makes a move, they very, very intentionally have to think about placing their mini in the perfect spot so that, you know, they're not accidentally too short for next. I want people to go, okay, I'm gonna move over here, drop it, and move on. Because this is just a representation of the theater of the mind game that we're playing. This is not a perfect 3D rendering of what's actually happening in the game world. It's just there as a visual aid as far as I'm concerned. I'm not playing a board game. I'm playing a role-playing game that is based in everybody's imagination. And this is just a way to stimulate that imagination and get everyone kind of on the same page. I mean, I've talked about that whole other subject before in a podcast, Something RPGish, which you should check out, and I will put in the link in the video below. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't care if somebody's mini is 1 inch too short of doing something cool, because that's just where somebody kind of casually dropped it. So I'm not measuring things. My table has a kind of shared tone of fairness and everybody's on the same page. I don't have people trying to cheat their moves. So I don't worry about the specifics of movement too much. I just want everybody to have a good time and play the game and to keep things fairly realistic as well. So that being said, obviously I think I've made it clear that I don't think having a grid is horrible. I think when the terrain lends itself to a grid work, that's fine and use it. I just don't feel the need to have it on everything. And I'm perfectly comfortable mixing and matching stuff with grids, stuff without. And you know what? Maybe I am going to have an epic boss battle in the throne room of this great castle, and I'm going to use gridded tiles because it's going to be a very tactical battle and movement is going to be very important. So I will have terrain with a grid on it for that encounter. But you know what? Maybe earlier in the session that same night, there was some diplomatic encounter in the longhouse of the town's jarl. That doesn't need a grid. I mean, it doesn't even necessarily need terrain. So I don't have it every encounter in every situation. Use as needed. I mean, you're all big kids. You can figure that out and realize that, hey, don't be a slave to the grid. Now let's just think about gridless terrain in a kind of pros and cons sense. What are the pros of gridless terrain? I think those should be pretty obvious. The big thing being is that it's far less restrictive when you are building, because you don't have to think about how do I put a grid on this thing that doesn't make sense, or how do I put it in this material that doesn't make sense, like a flocked grass board. You don't have to worry about that. You just make what you want to make. And obviously, once you make those things without a grid where they don't belong, your terrain pieces are going to be a lot more realistic looking. You know, a big bit of grass or field is going to look more realistic without a checkerboard on it. It's simple, it just will. What I really like about it though is that it makes your terrain far more versatile. There are a lot of tabletop games that use terrain but don't use a grid. So if you are a wargamer and an RPG player, if you put a grid on your terrain and then you drop it on your table to play a war game, it can look really stupid, honestly, and it doesn't need to be there. So having it without it makes it far more versatile for a wider scope of games. The other advantage, like I said, is if you are using some other measuring method rather than the checkerboard, you can measure things like circles and diagonals much more accurately. Another advantage, like I kind of touched on, is that it can, in theory, depending on the people who you're playing with, not having the grid can have players spend less time worrying about placing their PCs where they want to go, and just be more creative and fluid and role-play-ish rather than like they're playing chess. Now, that's not to say that gridless doesn't have its drawbacks, because it certainly does. It can, depending on the player, slow things down. If you are really strict about measurement, it can slow things down. Some players may have a hard time freeform visualizing their move without that checkerboard, especially if they've been playing with a grid for 20 years. But I think that that's learned behavior that can be changed if you want to. You don't have to, but if you want to, you can. Another drawback is stuff like area of effect. You know, certain spells, visualizing the area of influence is easier on a grid and a little bit more difficult on gridless if you don't make something to represent that. That is the biggest drawback that I found personally, but it's a trade-off that is worth it as far as I'm concerned. Another danger is discrepancy between players and DM of where distances actually are. When you have a grid, it's quite a bit clearer, although again, with diagonal movements and bending, you know, curving movements, there can be discrepancy there as well. You can get over that with a ruler or something that is very strict, like a string that has increments on it. So, I mean, really, there's pros and cons, just like there is with everything. If you like playing with a grid, you just enjoy it, and your players enjoy it, by all means do it and put it on all your stuff. That's fine. Just don't think that people who are playing without it are doing something wrong, because that's ridiculous. And if you're kind of on the fence wanting to play gridless, but are not sure how to handle combat, just know that there's a lot of other options and you can relax a little bit and stop worrying about it. One comment that I want to address that came up, I think, in one of the parts of the cave tile video, is someone said that without a grid on terrain, your pieces become models or display pieces and are no longer game pieces, which I thought that was the most ridiculous comment I've ever seen relating to gridless play. Specifically because while yes, D&D and RPG terrain often has a grid, terrain does not need a grid to be a game piece. Let's be realistic. Warhammer is a far bigger game than Dungeons and Dragons or similar RPGs. The world of terrain building in wargaming has been around a lot longer and is a lot bigger and a lot more involved than what we're doing for D&D, and they sure as shit don't have grids on their terrain. So to say something is not a valid or real game piece because there's no grid is so unfounded and ridiculous that I almost don't even want to address it. But come on, man. Have you never seen a wargaming table? There's no grid, and their terrain is often kicking our terrain's ass. So yeah, these are valid game pieces, even if there is no grid on it. So really, what's the whole point of this video? Well, basically, it's just trying to squish some questions that happen often in the communities and to give you my 2 cents on it. And again, however you want to play that makes you and your table happy, by all means, do it that way. Just know that there are options, and if other people are playing with terrain or a style that isn't what you like, well, you're not playing in their game, so shut up. Doesn't matter. Let people have their fun. That's the whole point of this whole hobby, isn't it? To sit around a table with some friends and have a good time and play a game and make some memories. The grid does not make those memories. I hope you found this video useful, guys. If you did, hit that like button. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I don't really have to ask. I'm sure some of you have already typed them before finishing the video. If you aren't a subscriber, hit subscribe. I'm trying to drop a video every Friday. I've been doing that pretty consistently for a couple months now. Don't forget to head over to the Black Magic Craft Facebook page. There you can drop me a question, post some pictures of your work, talk to other people. And if you want to purchase any of the tools and supplies that I use building my terrain and in my tutorials, and you want to help out Black Magic Craft financially, head on over to blackmagicraft.ca. There you will find my essential equipment store. It's my Amazon affiliate page, where anything you buy from there, I get a small commission that helps fund the channel. And actually anything you buy from there, after clicking on one of those links, I get a cut. You don't have to buy the actual stuff that I link to. It's just that that's the stuff I recommend. So if you're wondering, check it out. And of course, the best way you can help Black Magic Craft and thank me for the work that I'm doing, if you really like it, is by supporting me on Patreon. Those funds make a world of difference. We are also building an awesome Patreon community for everybody pledging $5 and up. So consider supporting and becoming a member of the family. And until next week, guys, happy crafting and happy gaming.